Dust billowed behind him, a reddish cloud clinging to the hooves of his tired horse. The sun beat down, relentless, on the vast, empty plains. Reverend Thomas Miller, a man of God from the bustling east, squinted against the glare, his gaze fixed on the faint smudge on the horizon that promised shelter and, he hoped, souls. It was 1859, and the American Southwest was a land of harsh beauty and even harsher realities. What happens when deep faith meets this untamed frontier, and a secret is too heavy to bear? Reverend Miller was not a man of weak constitution. He'd left the comfortable pews and predictable routines of his New England parish with a singular, burning purpose: missionary work. He believed with every fiber of his being that the light of the gospel was needed in these remote territories, a beacon against the wilderness both outside and within man. His journey had been long, a test of endurance against the elements, against isolation, and against the lurking dangers of a land still finding its footing. He'd faced thirst, hunger, and loneliness, but his faith had been his shield, his determination, an unbreakable resolve that pushed him onward, mile after dusty mile. Finally, the smudge grew clearer, resolving into buildings, then streets. Santa Fe. In 1859, it was a riot of sights and sounds, a bustling frontier town unlike anything Miller had ever known. It was a true melting pot, a mix of Native American traditions, Spanish colonial history, and the raw energy of Anglo settlers pushing westward. Miller, with his neat black suit and earnest demeanor, had arrived with a head full of idealistic expectations, picturing eager faces ready to embrace his message. The reality that hit him was far more raw. Saloons, their doors perpetually swinging, spilled loud music and boisterous laughter onto the dirt streets. Trading posts overflowed with goods and haggling voices. The inhabitants were a rough and tumble bunch, their faces weathered by sun and hardship, their eyes holding a certain wariness he hadn't anticipated. It was clear this was a place where strength, not just spirit, was admired. He spent his first few days observing, seeking out the pulse of the town, trying to understand where he might begin his mission. He needed to establish himself, perhaps find a sympathetic ear among the town's more influential citizens. It wasn't long before he started hearing a name whispered with a mixture of respect and a strange, almost fearful reverence: Silas Blackwood. Blackwood was a merchant, known for his considerable wealth and influence, his name attached to many of the town's enterprises. Yet, there was also talk of his reclusive nature, a certain darkness that seemed to cling to him like the desert dust. He rarely appeared in public, preferring to conduct his business through intermediaries. Despite the vague warnings that accompanied Blackwood's name, Miller felt an undeniable pull. He sensed a soul in need, a spiritual hunger that perhaps even Blackwood himself didn't recognize. He felt it was his calling to reach this man. Despite the subtle discouragement from those he spoke with, Miller was resolute. He sought an audience with Blackwood. It took some persistence, but eventually a meeting was arranged. Blackwood's establishment was not in the heart of the bustling plaza, but a little removed. A large, well-built trading post that looked more like a fortress than a shop. The air inside was cool, quiet, and smelled of leather and exotic spices. The initial meeting was tense, formal. Blackwood, a man of imposing stature, greeted him with a wary politeness, his eyes sharp and assessing. Miller, in turn, was earnest, his voice steady as he explained his purpose. He could feel the weight of unspoken things in the room, a heavy presence that seemed to emanate from the merchant himself. This was not going to be an easy conversion. Silas Blackwood sat across from Reverend Miller, a man who, despite his obvious success and the expensive cut of his clothes, carried a burden visible in the deep lines around his eyes. His gaze, though sharp, held a distant, troubled look, like someone constantly watching a storm on the horizon. He listened to Miller's gentle words about faith and spiritual peace, but his posture remained stiff, his arms crossed over his chest. It was clear he saw the pastor as an unwelcome intrusion, another person trying to pry into his carefully guarded world. Blackwood offered polite, almost dismissive responses, trying to steer the conversation back to more mundane topics, like the price of furs or the latest shipments from the East. But Miller was persistent, not in an aggressive way, but with a quiet, unwavering resolve. He spoke not of fire and brimstone, but of human failing, of the weight of secrets, and the profound relief that could come from unburdening one's soul. He spoke of redemption, not as an abstract concept, but as a path available to all, no matter how lost they felt. Blackwood shifted in his chair, a flicker of something unreadable crossing his face. A sigh escaped him, a sound heavy with years of unspoken things. He looked away, towards the window where the harsh Santa Fe sun beat down on the dusty street. "You speak of burdens, Reverend," Blackwood said, his voice low, almost a whisper. "But some burdens are too heavy for words. Some are meant to be carried alone until the grave." Miller leaned forward slightly, his expression one of profound empathy. "No burden is meant to be carried alone, Mr. Blackwood, and no secret is so dark that it cannot be brought into the light. God offers forgiveness, and sometimes, simply speaking it aloud to another human being can begin the healing." He emphasized the sanctity of confession, the trust placed in a confessor, assuring Blackwood that whatever was said would remain between them and God. A long silence hung in the air, broken only by the creaking of the floorboards as someone walked in an outer room. Blackwood's eyes, when they finally met Miller's, were raw, haunted. He took a deep, shaky breath, and then, slowly, haltingly, he began to speak. His voice was raspy at first, as if unused to forming such words. He spoke of a past shrouded in shadow, of desperate times and desperate measures. The initial details were vague, hints of a life lived on the edge, before New Mexico, before Santa Fe, before the wealth. He painted a picture of a younger man, driven by ambition and a fierce will to survive, but also by a gnawing fear of failure. The confession deepened, the words coming a little more freely now, though still laced with pain. He spoke of a partnership, a venture gone wrong, a dispute over land and gold that had turned ugly. He didn't use names at first, just the other man and the incident. But the weight of his words, the tremor in his voice, told Miller that this was no ordinary business disagreement. It was something far more grave, something that had stained his soul. The pastor listened intently, his initial shock at the raw emotion giving way to a profound concern. He felt a spiritual anguish for the man before him, a man clearly tormented by his past. As Blackwood continued, the details became clearer, chillingly so. It involved a betrayal, not just of trust, but of a friendship. It involved a desperate act, a moment of panic and greed that had led to a life being taken. Not directly, not with malice, but through a calculated decision that had left the other man to perish in the harsh, unforgiving wilderness. A wilderness Blackwood had navigated to safety, leaving his partner behind to die. The wealth Blackwood now possessed, the foundation of his empire in Santa Fe, was built upon that act, upon the absence of his partner, whose share he had claimed. It was not just a personal failing, but a crime, one that had had lasting and devastating consequences. Blackwood's face was etched with deep remorse and guilt, emotions that had clearly plagued him for years, festering beneath his outwardly composed exterior. He spoke of sleepless nights, of phantom voices in the wind, of the heavy silence of his grand house. Miller grappled with the enormity of the confession. His faith was challenged by the depth of human depravity, by the cold calculation that had led to such an act. Yet, it was also reinforced by the possibility of redemption, by the raw, undeniable need for forgiveness that emanated from Blackwood. He understood the profound trust Blackwood had placed in him, the weight of the secret that had just been laid bare. This confession was not merely a story, it was a desperate plea for absolution, a cry from a soul lost in its own darkness. Miller sat in silence for a long moment after Blackwood finished speaking, the heavy words hanging in the air between them. The lamp on the table cast long shadows, making the room feel smaller, more intimate, a vault for the terrible truth. He looked at Blackwood not with judgment but with a deep, sorrowful understanding. The man before him was a prisoner of his own past, his wealth a gilded cage. He had seen many forms of suffering in his life, but the torment of a soul haunted by its own actions was among the most profound. Finally, Miller spoke, his voice soft but firm. He explained that true repentance was not just about feeling bad, it was about changing direction, about turning away from the darkness and walking towards the light. He spoke of God's boundless mercy, but also of the necessity of facing the consequences of one's actions. He didn't offer easy absolution, because there was no such thing for a sin of this magnitude. Instead, he offered a path, a difficult, winding path that might lead to peace. He gently emphasized that forgiveness, both divine and human, often required a willingness to make amends, to right what was wrong, even if it seemed impossible. Blackwood listened, his head bowed, his hands clasped tightly. He was a man accustomed to control, to making decisions that shaped his world, but now he seemed utterly lost. He looked up, his eyes filled with a mixture of hope and despair. He admitted that the thought of exposure, of ruin, had been a constant companion, a silent threat that had kept him bound to his secret for all these years. He had built an empire on a lie, and dismantling it felt like tearing down his very foundation. How could he possibly seek forgiveness from those he had wronged when the wronged party was dead and his family likely scattered or unaware of the true circumstances? The very idea of restitution seemed abstract, impossible to implement without revealing everything. He questioned if true redemption was even possible for someone who had committed such an act, if the stain on his soul could ever truly be washed clean. His wealth, once a source of pride and security, now felt like a heavy chain. Miller understood Blackwood's dilemma. The path to redemption was rarely simple, especially when the past involved such a profound injustice. He suggested that making amends wasn't always about undoing the past, which was impossible, but about transforming the present and future. He proposed concrete steps, not as a punishment, but as a way to heal, both for Blackwood and, indirectly, for those affected by his past. Perhaps, he suggested, if Blackwood could not directly find the family of the other man, he could dedicate a significant portion of his ill-gotten gains to charitable works, to helping the less fortunate, to building up the community he now called home. This, Miller explained, would be a living penance, a way of redirecting the tainted wealth towards good. He also spoke of the importance of living a life dedicated to honesty and integrity from this day forward, a life that acknowledged the past but was not defined by it. The conversation explored the practical and ethical implications of revealing the truth versus carrying the secret. Miller did not demand public confession, knowing the potential for chaos and further harm. Instead, he focused on Blackwood's internal state, on the need for his soul to find peace. The pastor emphasized that the weight of the secret, the guilt, would continue to consume him until he took active steps towards atonement. He had planted the seeds of true change, offering not a quick fix, but a demanding journey. Blackwood sat deep in thought, his gaze fixed on some unseen point across the room. He had sought the pastor for relief, and he had found not an easy escape, but a stark challenge, a mirror held up to his soul. The confession had brought his past to the forefront, forcing him to confront it in a way he never had before. He now had a choice: continue to live under the shadow of his secret, or embark on the arduous path of making amends, of seeking a redemption that would reshape his entire existence. The answer was not immediate, but the question had been asked, and it hung heavy in the air. The pastor had offered guidance, but the decision and the difficult road ahead now rested squarely with Silas Blackwood. Silas Blackwood spent the next few days in a quiet struggle. The pastor's words echoed in his mind, a constant reminder of the choice that lay before him. He found himself pacing his opulent office, staring out at the bustling streets of Santa Fe, seeing not the vibrant trade but the faces of the past. The weight of his secret, which had felt like a suffocating blanket, now felt like a heavy stone pressing down, demanding a response. He watched his employees, his business partners, the people who looked up to him, and a new kind of guilt settled in. He had deceived them all, built his life on a foundation of lies. He tried to go about his usual business, but his focus was broken. Numbers blurred on ledgers, negotiations felt hollow. The easy camaraderie he once shared with some of his associates now felt like a performance. He knew he couldn't continue living like this, not after the conversation with Reverend Miller. The pastor hadn't condemned him, but had offered a different kind of challenge, one that spoke to the core of his being. Blackwood realized that the peace he craved wasn't found in hiding his secret, but in confronting it, in actively working to set things right. The first step, he decided, was to retrace his steps, to understand the full scope of the damage he had caused. He pulled out old maps, dusty journals, and began to painstakingly piece together the fragments of his past. He remembered the small mining town, the faces of the men he had worked with, the details of the fateful incident. It was a painful process, forcing him to relive moments he had tried for years to bury. Each memory, each detail he unearthed, solidified his resolve. He couldn't undo what was done, but he could change how he lived with it. He sent a quiet message to Reverend Miller, requesting another meeting. This time, there was no hesitation, no wariness in Blackwood's tone. When the pastor arrived, he found a man who looked tired, but also strangely resolute. Blackwood didn't speak of absolution immediately or of grand gestures. Instead, he started with practicalities. He wanted to know how to find the families, how to make restitution without causing further disruption. He understood that this journey would be long and complicated, but he was ready to begin. Pastor Miller listened, a quiet sense of relief washing over him. He saw genuine repentance in Blackwood's eyes, not just fear of discovery. He offered advice on discreet inquiries, suggesting that Blackwood hire trusted individuals to help locate descendants without revealing the full, sensitive nature of the search. He also spoke about the power of anonymous acts of charity, of building schools or hospitals in the regions where the original wrong had occurred, as a way to honor the memory of those who had suffered. It was a pragmatic approach, blending spiritual guidance with the harsh realities of the world. Blackwood began to implement the plan. He started by discreetly allocating a significant portion of his wealth to a separate fund earmarked for these new endeavors. He tasked his most trusted legal advisor, a man known for his discretion and loyalty, with the delicate job of researching old records and tracing family lines. The process was slow, filled with dead ends and false leads, but Blackwood pressed on. He found a strange solace in the work, a sense of purpose that had been missing for decades. The heavy stone in his chest hadn't disappeared, but it felt less suffocating, more like a weight he was actively lifting. He knew this was just the beginning of a very long road, but for the first time in a long time, Silas Blackwood felt a glimmer of hope. He wasn't free, not yet, but he was finally moving towards it. The search for the descendants proved to be more challenging than Blackwood or Miller had initially imagined. Years had passed, families had moved, names had changed, and the frontier itself had shifted constantly. Many of the records from that era were incomplete or simply didn't exist. Yet Blackwood refused to be deterred. He saw each obstacle not as a reason to give up, but as another layer of the penance he had to pay. His legal advisor, a meticulous man named Mr. Finch, worked tirelessly, cross-referencing old land deeds, census records, and even local newspaper archives from the dusty towns that had sprung up and sometimes vanished. One day, a breakthrough arrived. Mr. Finch discovered a distant relative of one of the wronged families, living in a small, isolated community several days' ride from Santa Fe. This relative, an elderly woman named Elena, was a direct descendant of one of the men whose land had been unjustly taken. She carried stories passed down through generations, tales of hardship and injustice that resonated eerily with Blackwood's own buried memories. The details she recounted, the names, the dates, the specific locations, all matched what Blackwood had confessed to Pastor Miller. It was a stark reminder of the long shadow his past actions had cast. Blackwood felt a profound mix of relief and renewed guilt. Relief that he had finally found a tangible link, a way to begin making amends. Guilt, because Elena's story painted a vivid picture of the suffering his ambition had caused. He felt the familiar knot in his stomach, but this time it was accompanied by a sense of purpose. He immediately began planning his trip to meet Elena, understanding the gravity of what he was about to do. This wasn't just about money, it was about acknowledging a wrong, about seeking a form of forgiveness that no amount of wealth could buy. Pastor Miller, when informed of the discovery, offered his quiet support. He knew the path Blackwood was choosing was fraught with emotional difficulty. He reminded Blackwood that true repentance wasn't just about the act of restitution, but about the spirit in which it was offered. It needed to be genuine, humble, and without expectation of immediate absolution. Blackwood nodded, understanding. He wasn't looking for a quick fix for his soul. He was prepared for the long, arduous journey of reconciliation. The journey to Elena's home was a solitary one, allowing Blackwood ample time for reflection. He thought about the man he had been, driven by greed and a desire for power, and the man he was trying to become. The vast, empty landscapes he rode through seemed to mirror the emptiness he had felt inside for so long. He understood now that his wealth, built on a foundation of injustice, had never brought him true peace. It had only amplified his isolation. When he finally arrived at Elena's modest adobe home, he felt a tremor of fear, a feeling he hadn't experienced in years. He was no longer the powerful merchant, but a man seeking redemption. Elena, with her weathered face and clear, sharp eyes, greeted him with a cautious curiosity. Blackwood introduced himself simply, without mentioning his fortune or his past deeds directly. He spoke of historical records, of a desire to right old wrongs. He listened patiently as Elena recounted her family's history, her voice filled with a quiet strength that moved him deeply. He knew this was the moment. He had to tell her the truth. He took a deep breath and began to speak, his voice uncharacteristically soft, confessing his part in her family's long-ago hardship. Elena listened, her expression unchanging at first. Her eyes, though, held a flicker of recognition, a dawning comprehension that slowly deepened into something like sorrow, then anger. Blackwood laid out the details of his betrayal, the cunning ways he had manipulated documents, bribed officials, and exploited vulnerabilities to seize her family's land. He didn't spare himself, detailing the cold calculation behind each step, the relentless pursuit of profit that had blinded him to the human cost. He spoke of the families displaced, the lives uprooted, the generational poverty that had followed. He watched her face as he spoke, bracing himself for her fury, for the righteous indignation he knew he deserved. But instead of an outburst, a quiet dignity settled over Elena. When he finished, the silence in the small room was heavy, broken only by the distant chirping of birds. She took a slow breath, her gaze steady on his. "My grandmother used to tell us stories," she began, her voice raspy with age but firm. "Stories of a man who came from nowhere, who seemed to have all the luck. She called him the Shadow. She said he stole the sunlight from our fields." Blackwood flinched, the casual cruelty of his past actions laid bare by her simple words. "We always wondered," Elena continued, "if we would ever know the truth, if anyone would ever admit what was done." She didn't weep, didn't shout. Her composure was more devastating than any rage. She simply looked at him, a lifetime of her family's suffering reflected in her eyes. Blackwood found himself unable to meet her gaze for long, his shame a physical weight. He had prepared for anger, for accusations, but not for this quiet, profound sadness. He spoke again, his voice barely above a whisper. "I have no excuse, Elena. What I did was wrong, terribly wrong. I can't undo the past, but I want to try to make amends. I want to give back what was taken and more. I want to help your family, your community." Elena finally broke her stare, looking down at her gnarled hands in her lap. "Money," she said, her voice flat. "Can money bring back the lost years? Can it feed the children who went hungry? Can it heal the broken hearts?" Blackwood understood her skepticism. He knew that material wealth alone couldn't erase the scars. "No," he admitted, "it can't, but it can offer a measure of justice. It can provide for the future. It can show that I understand the depth of my wrongdoing." He explained his plan, not just to return the value of the land, but to invest in the community, to build schools, a clinic, to create opportunities that generations of her family had been denied. He laid out the legal documents, the deeds, the financial proposals. He had brought Mr. Finch's carefully prepared papers, outlining a comprehensive plan for restitution and community development. Elena listened, her eyes moving from the documents to Blackwood's face. She asked probing questions, demonstrating a sharp mind and a deep understanding of her people's needs. She wasn't easily swayed by grand gestures or empty promises. She wanted to know the details, the safeguards, the long-term commitment. Blackwood answered honestly, his sincerity evident in his quiet, earnest tone. He made no demands, offered no conditions beyond the hope of helping to heal the wounds he had inflicted. The conversation stretched on for hours, moving from the past injustice to the practicalities of the future. Elena eventually called in her children and grandchildren, introducing Blackwood to them as the man who had come to speak of old wrongs and new beginnings. The younger generations, initially wary, listened with growing interest as Blackwood explained his intentions. There was no immediate embrace, no sudden forgiveness. There was a cautious hope, a fragile opening. Elena, representing her ancestors and her descendants, finally nodded. "It is a start," she said simply, "a very long overdue start." Blackwood felt a profound sense of relief, a weight he hadn't fully realized he was carrying beginning to lift. This was not the end of his journey, but a crucial, arduous step. He knew true absolution would be a lifelong pursuit, but for the first time in decades he saw a path forward. Reverend Miller, who had observed much of this from a respectful distance, now approached, his presence a quiet affirmation of the path Blackwood had chosen. He saw the genuine, if still nascent, change in the merchant. The haunted look in Blackwood's eyes had softened, replaced by a weariness that seemed less about guilt and more about the sheer effort of facing his past. The pastor understood that true redemption was not a single event, but a continuous journey of action and accountability. He placed a hand gently on Blackwood's shoulder. "Silas," he said, his voice low and kind, "you have taken the first, hardest steps. The Lord's grace is boundless for those who seek to mend what is broken." Blackwood looked at Miller, a flicker of gratitude in his eyes. "It's far from over, Pastor. This is just the beginning of what I owe." Elena, still composed but with a hint of something resembling peace, turned to Miller. "Your words, Reverend, they helped him find his way here. For that, we are grateful." The pastor inclined his head. "My purpose is simply to guide. The choice and the burden of action always rests with the individual." Over the following months, Silas Blackwood completely transformed his life. He divested himself of the properties acquired through his past misdeeds, ensuring they were returned to the rightful descendants, often with additional compensation. He poured a significant portion of his remaining wealth into the community Elena represented. Schools were built, offering education to children who had never known a classroom. A small clinic, staffed by a traveling doctor and local healers, began to serve the sick. Wells were dug, bringing fresh water to arid lands. Blackwood himself, once a reclusive figure, became a visible presence, overseeing the projects, listening to the needs of the people, and working alongside them. He faced skepticism, of course. Not everyone believed his change was genuine. Some saw his actions as a desperate attempt to buy forgiveness, others as a cunning scheme. But Blackwood persevered, his commitment unwavering. He didn't seek accolades or immediate acceptance. He simply continued to work, day after day, year after year, allowing his deeds to speak for themselves. He never fully escaped the shadow of his past, nor did he expect to. The memory of his wrongs remained a constant companion, not as a source of despair, but as a powerful motivator to live a life of service and humility. Reverend Miller stayed in Santa Fe for several more years, establishing a small mission and continuing his ministry. He and Blackwood remained close, their bond forged in the crucible of confession and redemption. Miller often observed Blackwood, no longer the haunted merchant, but a man weathered by experience, whose eyes now held a quiet strength and a deep, empathetic understanding of human suffering. He saw that true faith wasn't just about belief, but about action, about the arduous, often painful work of making things right. Eventually, Miller felt his work in Santa Fe was complete and moved on to other frontiers, carrying with him the profound lessons learned from Silas Blackwood. Blackwood, in turn, lived out his days in Santa Fe, not as a wealthy merchant, but as a respected, if still somewhat enigmatic, figure. His legacy became less about the fortune he once amassed and more about the lives he touched, the community he helped rebuild, and the quiet testament to the enduring power of repentance and making amends. The story of Silas Blackwood and Reverend Thomas Miller became a quiet legend in Santa Fe, a tale whispered around campfires and told in hushed tones in adobe homes. It was a story not of perfect heroes, but of flawed individuals who, through a moment of courage and an unwavering commitment to truth, found a way to heal old wounds and forge a path towards a more just future. It showed that even in the harshest landscapes and from the darkest corners of the human heart, the seeds of redemption could take root and blossom, given enough time, effort, and a guiding hand. This was the true legacy, a testament to the fact that no secret was too heavy and no past too dark to prevent the possibility of a new beginning.